Hi guys, and welcome back to History 240. So as you can tell, the sinuses are clear, so you guys can understand me a little bit better this week. But, all things considered, it's been a very busy week, and it sounds like I'm not the only one who's had a really, really busy week. Based on some of the emails I've gotten, it just seems like this has been a fairly difficult week for everyone. So believe me when I say that you're not alone. Beginning of the semester is always really hard on everyone. So take a deep breath, guys. You guys should be, once I finish grading this weekend, you guys should be in a pretty good spot for your first test. So you shouldn't have to worry too badly about, not having enough points to do well in the class despite, not doing super great on the test and things like that. You should be in a fairly good spot at this point based on all of the assignments that you've done this far. So that being said, couple of updates for the class. So I had sent out a mass email with my executive decision. Turns out my executive decision is not so executive after all. So I did have one or two people object. So we are going to move things back to Wednesday nights. And so the lectures should be posted by midnight on Wednesday nights. Now, if you guys don't mind, just to kind of be lenient with that time, if you guys don't mind. Right now, I think I told you guys that I'm in a PhD program at the University of Kentucky. In the last week, I've had to read 3 full books. I've had a research paper due, and then had several other things that were due this week too. So it's been a fun week, and I had my car towed. So it's been interesting to say the least. So if you guys don't mind, I'm still getting used to doing things this way, and trying to get used to a new atmosphere, a new learning environment, just like you guys are. And for those of you guys who are new to taking classes online, you'll know kind of what that experience is like. So just be patient with me if you don't mind. I'm hoping to get everything caught up this week, and so that way you guys will know what your grades look like prior to going into the first test. That's my goal. So that being said, and having taken care of all of the housework for this class, let's go on to the lecture, and hopefully we can get through this pretty quickly. This is the last stuff that we need to cover prior to the test. So you should be in a pretty good spot with lectures from this test. Make sure you guys are highlighting. Make sure you guys are defining people, places, and terms. There's not an essay on this, so just take your time on the test. It's going to be multiple choice. So next week you guys won't have a lecture. You should just have your test, and that should be it, and you won't have to worry about anything else for the rest of the week. And you may have maybe a primary source document analysis, but I don't think so. And I don't think you have any summaries either. I'll have to check into that and get back with you guys. So moving on from there, let's get to the fun stuff, because we get to cover some really, really cool aspects of Kentucky history tonight. Namely, the rise of the Whig Party and the prominence of certain characters who I'm sure that you guys as Kentuckians, a lot of you guys are Kentuckians, I'm sure you've heard of, but maybe you didn't know a whole lot about them. We're going to cover another war, and we're going to cover Henry Clay, who is really freaking cool. So I hope you guys have as much fun with this as I do, and let's get started. So let me pull up what I need to here. So if you guys don't mind, go ahead and head to your first real slide entitled Kentucky Economy After 1812. So we know that Kentucky's economy prior to 1812, there's a lot of trapping, there's a lot of fur trade going on. There's some farming going on. But really after 1812, the War of 1812, the entire economy is agrarian based. It's just farming. But slavery is not as ingrained in Kentucky as it would be for the deeper South. So there are far less slaves altogether in Kentucky than there are at any point in the deeper South, and say the Carolinas or Mississippi or Alabama, places like that. And there's a couple of different reasons why this would be, but the main reason is that the crops after 1812 become far less labor intensive. And we're starting to see, even though Kentucky is still a large producer of hemp and tobacco, they're starting to move away from hemp and tobacco as a product that they're selling, and they're moving to less labor intensive crops, so less work that they have to do with them. Slavery laws in both 1815 and 1830 limit the importation of slaves, so there are less slaves that are physically coming into Kentucky and staying in Kentucky. Many of them who are here, if there's a case where a couple of slaves a slave couple may have a child, depending on whether the mother of that child is free or slave, that will be the determining factor on whether or not that child is a free person or a slave. So many Kentuckians view slavery as a renewable resource for that reason, and they're less likely to free female slaves than they are male slaves, because they're kind of giving up that income and that renewable resource. But with the Non-Importation Act of 1833, this bans the importation of slaves for both personal and commercial use. But this is really widely violated across the Tennessee border in Kentucky. So while you may have other areas within Kentucky that lose that kind of abundant slave atmosphere and abilities to get slaves, we'll see that Kentucky will move away from that progressively throughout time and up to the Civil War. Slavery is a principal issue that leads to the rewriting of the Kentucky Constitution in 1849, and will help us establish the Second Constitutional Convention in Kentucky. So while you guys are on this page, take a look at some of the pictures that you've got here. So we've got a signpost from one of the leading slave trading houses in Kentucky, and that is specifically in Louisville. And normally Kentucky is exporting anywhere from between 2,500 and 4,000 slaves downriver to larger plantations. And so this is really important to remember when we think of the movement of these less labor-intensive crops. People are, yes, losing that need for slaves, but they're not losing money on them necessarily, because they're sending them down the river. They're selling them off. They're not freeing their slaves. So just keep that in mind as we go along. And then with the slave trade in Louisville, you also have to keep in mind that these slaves are going along the Ohio River and near the Ohio River. So there is a lot of slaves that are escaping into Ohio through Kentucky. And you can see some of the rewards for slaves, and just kind of look at their descriptions. Look at what they say about them as human beings. Look at their kind of, really general names. Tom, Emily. None of them have particularly like vibrant names like you might see these days within African American communities, but their descriptions, if you'll notice, you'll see that for many slaves, you'll notice that men are more valuable than women. And the majority of that is just because of the nature of the crops that they harvest. So slaves who are men will do more labor-intensive work than, say, slaves who are women, who might do something like dyeing or cooking or cleaning or something along those lines. Men like poor Tom here, who was a runaway, they may end up doing something far more labor intensive, like working in sugarcane, working in cotton, things like that. And you'll see a lot of women, yes, working in cotton, but really it's the men that do the really labor intensive section of that. So let's move on from there to the rise of the Whigs, and we'll kind of pop back and forth between the Whigs and slavery and political ideas and those kinds of things. So with the rise of the Whigs, we talked a little bit about the Whig Party under Henry Clay the other day. So we've got to get a little bit more specific in why they're important in Kentucky and in U.S. history. So the Whigs are a political party from the early to mid 1800s, so between 1834 and 1854. They only last about 20 years, but they're founded by a couple of really famous people in U.S. history. So Henry Clay, William Henry Harrison, Daniel Webster, and Horace Greeley. And Horace Greeley is the fabulous man with the overflowing neck beard. Thought you guys would enjoy that picture. But then Daniel Webster is the fellow who's there to the left of him. And of course you'll know the person right below him, Andrew Jackson, who becomes a president during a time where the Whigs are coming to power. So they will have 2 presidents and 5 candidates. And their origins are in Jacksonian politics. And what that means is it's from the era that Jackson was president. So from the time of Jackson's election in 1828 to approximately the Civil War. And this time period is known as the second party system. Because instead of having Democratic Republicans and just Republicans, I think was the other one. We have a mix of Democrats and Whigs, and the names of the parties will kind of change over time. They all tend to stay around that Democrat and Republican title, but they kind of switch sides there for a little while, and they'll move back and forth with kind of their ideas for what is appropriate in politics and things like that. It's really super interesting, and if you're interested in it, you should look up a book called, I want to say it's The Right to Vote. That's really good for that. It's a really good book that you should read anyway, but it discusses politics and who is able to vote at what time during the ages that we're talking about here. So, moving on from that, in 1831, Henry Clay starts planning a new party based on national interest over secular interest. And what secular means is that it's just a very small area of the country. So Henry Clay is looking at the big picture of the nation, as opposed to only what's happening in Alabama, what's happening in Kentucky, what's happening in Ohio, and that kind of thing. So with this, you guys need to understand a little bit about what's going on with the politics at this time. So I'm going to go over the Jacksonians first, and that will kind of help make a little bit more sense about why Whigs feel the way that they do. So Jacksonians are opposed to a Bank of the United States, so having a single bank that has the Treasury in it, that has the majority of the banking stock for the nation, those kinds of things. They're horribly, horribly opposed to that, and it's under Jackson that the Bank of the United States tanks. They also are opposed to internal improvements, and by that I mean strictly infrastructure. They're opposed to the creation of new roads. They're opposed to the creation of new buildings, things that will help to make America more navigable, if that makes sense. They're opposed to egalitarian democracy, and what that means is that they're opposed to democracy where the entire population of white males votes. They're opposed to very centralized state powers. They want to have a large amount of national powers. And they want to use hard money. They don't want to have anything to do with stocks or using money that's on credit, anything like that. They're completely opposed to it. But they do support something called protective tariffs. And these are an important export tax. And I know that the tariffs have come up in the news quite a lot here recently, so I'm sure most of you guys, if you've been watching the news, kind of have a good idea of what a tariff is. But what this is doing in essence, and what the theory behind it is, that that they protect American markets by buying American goods. But New England is mainly the ones who benefit from this. So the Southern detractors will call it the Tariff of Abominations. And this will lead them to lead directly to them nullifying the claims and stating that these are unconstitutional in 1828. This is headed by South Carolina. And a lot of people see this as a kind of precursor to the Civil War. But this is called the Nullification Crisis, and it lasts from about 1832 to about 1837. And so with this, you'll see 62% of a tax on 92% of imports, if that makes sense. So you've got 92% of all of the items that are imported. There's a 62% tax on those specific items. And it has a direct impact on the Southern economy. So what this looks like is that the UK produces items that the US does not. For example, clothing, finished goods, tables, things like that. And so the cost of these items are going to be higher to produce and higher to sell because of the tariffs, which means that there are going to be less people buying them. So the UK doesn't have as much money coming in, and so they will stop getting cotton in order to make textiles to send back. So this will have a direct hit on the Southern economy, okay? So with that, on the flip side of this, you've got the Whigs, who are seen as very modernizing figures, especially when you consider all of the items that's on their docket for trying to improve Kentucky and trying to improve the nation. So they take over Jefferson's ideals of trying to compromise and create a solution that works. They're opposed to manifest destiny, and I'm sure that this is a term that most of you guys have heard before, especially when we talk about expansionism. This idea that, God wants us to go into areas and to take over those lands and bring them into our own for Christianizing purposes, or for the fact that these were white males, and that because they were white males, they had a duty to go into these places because of their manifest destiny and take over a place. And they don't want to deal with the slavery issue at all. They do their very best to kind of deal with this in the most roundabout way possible. And in a lot of ways, they'll consider certain states, especially Texas, as an unprincipled land grab. So we really don't need that land. There's no reason that we should have it. So obviously you must just be trying to get land, and for no good or solid reason. They also support a very balanced government. So they want to have a government where the income and the outcome are kind of coming together and balanced. They have a very balanced budget. But they want to create a bigger government. They want to have a government that's got many hands and many cookie jars, and to create national unity through the federal government. They want to produce more infrastructure, bridges, roads, things like that, and to help promote domestic manufacturing. Clay proposes high tariffs as part of the American system, but they're not really the same kind of tariffs that we see as such an issue under Jackson and with the nullification crisis. These tariffs are to promote things like industry, a national bank like the Bank of the United States, which Jackson kills. They want to have federal subsidies for roads and internal improvements, land revenues. They want to stabilize and regulate local banks, currency, and government. So all of these things that kind of make the nation stronger the way it is in its smaller state. So there are a couple of presidential elections based off of Whig politics. So when they first start out in 1836, there's not really enough of a following for them to have a national candidate. But by 1840, William Henry Harrison is nominated and wins the presidency. But John Tyler ends up becoming president after William Henry Harrison dies from pneumonia. And he is in office only 31 days before he dies, which makes him the shortest administration in U.S. history for a single president. And this leads directly from the party to the party vetoing certain Whig economic legislation in 1841. And so there's an internal disunity problem. So this we'll see that this group doesn't hang on very much longer from here. Clay is nominated in 1844 for the presidency, and he loses. And he's associated with upper class, so the lower men who are without property, they can't vote, but they don't want to vote for somebody who would not support this for them anyway. And so Zachary Taylor, General Zachary Taylor, is nominated and is elected in 1848. So going on